The first time one of my friends from back home asked if my girlfriend's parents were my age, I laughed it off. It was a predictable jab, the kind of thing you expect. The 10th time, it started to feel less like a joke and more like a verdict they'd passed on me, a judgment delivered from thousands of miles away without any evidence. They saw a number, and they thought they had the whole story figured out. I'm 63. My girlfriend, Alina, is 28. We're building a life together here in Bucharest, Romania. And yes, we hear the whispers when we walk into a restaurant. We see the stares. We feel the quiet calculations in people's eyes as they try to solve the equation of us. They look at my gray hair, they look at her, and they think they have the answer. They think it's about money. They think it's a transaction. A simple, sad story they've heard 100 times before. But that story, the one they write in their heads in a matter of seconds, it isn't our story. And what they don't understand is how little any of that matters when you finally stop living for everyone else and start living for yourself. How little power that judgment has when you've traded a life of quiet desperation for one of genuine connection. To understand how I got here, sitting in this apartment, happier than I've been in 30 years, you can't start in Bucharest. You have to go back to Des Moines, Iowa. You have to go back to a silent house, an empty calendar, and the crushing feeling that my best years were already gone. You have to start there to understand how it all began. For 40 years, my world was built on concrete, steel, and spreadsheets. I was a project manager for a commercial construction company in Des Moines. My job was to take a blueprint, an idea on paper, and make it real. I managed budgets in the millions, timelines that seemed impossible, and crews of contractors who respected me because I was fair, I was meticulous, and I delivered. The logic was simple. You have a plan, you execute the plan, you measure the results. That's how you build a skyscraper, and for a long time, I thought that's how you build a life. My life was built around two pillars, my work and my marriage to Sarah. We were high school sweethearts, 38 years together. When I retired and the kids had long been out of the house, one of those pillars just disappeared. And without the daily grind of the job, Sarah and I discovered that we had become two polite strangers living under the same roof. The divorce wasn't a big, dramatic explosion. It was more like a slow, quiet erosion that nobody noticed until the foundation was gone. It was amicable, but it left me in a condo that felt more like a waiting room than a home. Suddenly, I was a project manager with no project. My days became a carbon copy of the one before. I'd wake up, have my coffee, and spend an hour online managing my investments. My finances were solid. I had a pension that paid out a reliable $4,500 a month, and after splitting our assets, my 401k had a balance of $650,000. I wasn't rich, but I was secure. I knew how to manage money. It was just another kind of project. But after that, the day would just stretch out into a gray fog. A trip to the grocery store was the big event of the day. The evenings were the worst. Just me, the television, and the profound, crushing silence of a life that felt like it was over. My whole identity, the one I had built for 4 decades, had been erased. The change didn't come from some grand revelation. It came on a random Tuesday night, out of sheer boredom and loneliness. I was clicking through YouTube, as you do, and fell down a rabbit hole of travel videos. I saw one about Bucharest, Romania. It talked about the history, the architecture, and the surprisingly low cost of living. It was purely informational, but it planted a thought. The same week, an old buddy from my army days posted pictures on Facebook. He was living in the Philippines with his new wife, who was much younger, and he just looked happy, genuinely happy. The two things combined in my head, but not in the way you might think. I didn't see a picture of a younger woman and think, I need to find one of those. That wasn't the thought process. A project manager doesn't start with a vague desire. He starts with a problem statement. And my problem was, how can I maximize the quality of my life with the resources I have? My retirement in Des Moines was costing me a certain amount, and the return on investment, in terms of happiness, was close to zero. The engineer in me saw it as an optimization problem, so I approached it like any new project. I started the research phase. I wasn't looking for a relationship. I was looking for data. I joined an expat forum for Bucharest, not to socialize, but to gather information. My first posts were about the nuts and bolts. What are the residency requirements? How stable is the banking system? What's the real cost of high-speed internet? I was building a new blueprint, and I needed hard numbers. I needed to know if the data would support the decision, because at the time, that's all it was, a decision about logistics, not about life. My posts on that forum were sterile, almost robotic. I asked about average utility costs in the winter. I asked about the process for getting a long-stay visa. I was getting good information, but it was just a list of facts and figures. It was one person in particular, a forum moderator, who started turning those numbers into a picture I could actually see. Her username was just Alina T, and she answered questions with a clarity and precision I recognized. She didn't just give you an answer. She explained the why behind it. She'd write these long, detailed posts about navigating the city's bureaucracy or the subtle cultural differences an American might not expect. I found myself looking for her posts specifically. She wasn't just another voice in the crowd. She was competent. And for a project manager, competence is magnetic. I was running the numbers constantly. I built a spreadsheet. Of course I did. In one column, my life in Des Moines, the condo association fees, the property taxes, the car insurance, the weekly grocery bill that seemed to get higher every single time. It all added up to about $3,500 a month, and that was for a life that felt like it was running on fumes. In the other column, Bucharest. Based on what I was reading, I could rent a modern, clean, two-bedroom apartment for under $1,000. People were reporting total monthly living costs, all in, of around $2,000. My pension alone, the $4,500 a month, would cover that more than twice over. My nest egg, the $650,000, could just sit there, untouched, growing. The data didn't just support the decision, it was practically screaming it at me. It was the most logical, financially sound move I could possibly make. A 40% reduction in cost for a potential 100% increase in life quality. The ROI was undeniable. But here's the thing about spreadsheets. They don't account for fear. They don't have a cell for that knot in your stomach. I'd see pictures on those forums of guys my age, Westerners, with local women half their age. And I'd read the comments, the snide remarks, the dismissive tone, the assumption that it was all just a simple transaction. And my deepest fear, the one that kept me up at night in that silent condo, was that they were right. That my time for genuine connection was over. That the only value I had left was the number in my bank account. The engineer in me saw the flawless logic of the move, but the man who had just spent 38 years in a marriage that slowly faded to nothing was terrified of getting it wrong all over again. That fear is what almost stopped me. It's what kept my cursor hovering over the cancel button instead of confirm. For 2 weeks, I was paralyzed. I'd open the forum, read a post from Alina explaining something with her usual intelligence, feel a surge of optimism, and then I'd see another picture, another comment, and the doubt would come rushing back in. The project was stalled. The breakthrough came from the same place all my other breakthroughs had come from for 40 years, my job. I thought, what would I do if this were a construction project? If a subcontractor told me there was a potential issue on site, I wouldn't just shut down the whole operation. I wouldn't make a multi-million-dollar decision based on a rumor or a third-hand report. I'd get in my truck, drive to the site, and see it with my own eyes. You can't solve a problem from a distance. You have to get on the ground. And that was it. That was the shift. This wasn't a marriage proposal. It wasn't a lifelong commitment. It was a scouting trip, a 1-month, on-the-ground feasibility study. The objective was simple: verify the data. See if the city felt right. Meet a few people from the forum for a coffee. No pressure, just information gathering. I sent a private message to Alina, the moderator. I kept it professional, to the point. I thanked her for her detailed posts and told her I was planning a 1-month trip to do some research and would appreciate any final advice. After 3 months of crunching numbers and fighting with my own fears, I finally booked the ticket. It was just one flight, from Des Moines to Bucharest, but it felt like I was finally laying the foundation for something new. Stepping out of the Henri Coanda airport was like walking from a black and white movie into color. It wasn't just the architecture or the language I couldn't understand. It was the air itself. It felt different, heavier with history, filled with the smell of diesel and baked bread. For 40 years, I managed job sites. You can study blueprints and satellite images all day, but you don't know a thing until you walk the dirt. This was me, walking the dirt. My 1-month feasibility study had officially begun. I'd arranged to meet Alina for coffee the next afternoon. We chose a small cafe in Centru Vecchi, the old town. I got there 20 minutes early. I sat at a small outdoor table, watching the crowds, and every doubt I'd ever had came rushing back. What was I doing here? This was crazy. I was a 63-year-old retired guy from Iowa, about to have coffee with a 28-year-old Romanian woman I'd met on the internet. The word fool kept flashing in my mind. Every possible negative outcome played out in my head. This was the moment the project could fail. The moment the whole structure could collapse because of a single, faulty assumption. And then I saw her. She walked through the crowded square with a sense of purpose, her eyes scanning the tables. She looked exactly like her profile picture, but more vibrant, more real. She saw me, and a genuine, unforced smile broke across her face. All that anxiety, that knot in my stomach, it just dissolved. She sat down, and before the waiter even arrived, we were talking. And it was easy. The 3 months of messages had built a foundation I hadn't even realized was there. The first 20 minutes were about the things we'd always discussed. My flight, my first impressions of the city, the apartment I was renting for the month. Practicalities. Logistics. My comfort zone. But then, she leaned forward and asked a question that changed everything. She said, "So, John, the spreadsheets and the visa questions are fine, but tell me about the man who asks them. Why are you really here?" And for the first time in years, I told the truth. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. I talked about the silence of the condo. I talked about feeling invisible, about my fear that my life's work was done and there was nothing left to build. I didn't plan to say any of it. It just came out. And she didn't just listen. She heard me. She didn't offer pity. She offered understanding. She told me about her own life, about her dreams of traveling, and the frustration of feeling like her generation was hitting a ceiling in their own country. For a few hours, in that busy cafe, we weren't an age gap. We were just two people from different worlds, realizing we shared the same fundamental human desire to build a life that mattered. At one point, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "People will look at us and they will make up a story. You know that, right?" I nodded. I told her it was my biggest fear. And she said, "My fear is living a life where I do what everyone expects, and I wake up at 40 and realize I never took a single risk for myself." She was drawn to my experience, she said, to the fact that I had built things, that I knew what it took. I was drawn to her fire, to the simple, incredible fact that when she looked at me, I felt seen. Not as a number in a bank account, not as a stereotype, but as a person, as John. That night, after we said goodbye, I walked through the city for hours. The initial euphoria wasn't just about Alina. It was about everything. I had dinner at a restaurant she'd recommended. A beautiful, 3-course meal with a good glass of red wine. The bill came. It was the equivalent of $30. 30. I almost laughed out loud. The number on my spreadsheet was real. All the data points were real. The life that I had calculated was possible. It was right here. My 1-month scouting trip became a 2-month trip. I called the airline the next day and changed the ticket. It wasn't a feasibility study anymore. I wasn't just visiting. I was figuring out the logistics of how soon I could come home. Flying back to Iowa was like the plane was traveling backwards in time. I left Bucharest in the spring, a city exploding with green, and landed back in Des Moines to a landscape that was still gray and brown, stubbornly clinging to the memory of winter. The 2-month trip had felt like a lifetime. Walking back into my condo was the real shock. The silence I had gotten used to before now felt physically oppressive. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. The air was stale. Nothing had changed, but everything was different. I sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd sat just a few months earlier feeling like my life was over, and I knew with absolute certainty that this place was no longer my home. It was just the last phase of a project that needed to be closed out. I approached it like any other job. I made a list, created a timeline. Sell the condo, sell the car, go through 40 years of accumulated stuff and decide what to keep, what to sell, what to give away. The hardest part was telling my kids. My son, who lives in California, was surprisingly okay with it. He said, "Dad, if it makes you happy, go for it." But my daughter, Sarah, that was a different conversation. She came over to the condo. I saw the look on her face. It was the same look I used to get from a client when I told them we were behind schedule. A mixture of disappointment and worry. She sat at the kitchen table, the one she'd done her homework at for years, and she said, "Dad, I'm just going to be honest. I'm worried." She's 28. What do you really have in common with a 28-year-old from Romania? I didn't get defensive. I just laid out the facts, project manager style. I told her about our conversations, about who Alina was as a person, about her ambition, her intelligence. I tried to explain that the connection was based on respect before anything else. But I could see I wasn't getting through. She kept circling back to the same point. It just looks a certain way, Dad. Finally, she said the thing that was really on her mind. Are you sure she's not just with you for the money? For a green card? And there it was. My own deepest fear, spoken out loud by my own daughter. I looked at her, and I didn't give her a sales pitch. I just told her the truth. I said, Sarah, your mother and I were the perfect age. We had everything in common, and we ended up like strangers. All I know is that when I'm with Alina, I don't feel like a wallet. I don't feel old. I feel like myself, and I haven't felt that way in a very, very long time. This is a risk. I know it is. But staying here, in this silence, that's not a risk. That's a guarantee of being miserable. I'm not asking for your permission, but I hope, one day, you'll give me your understanding. The conversation didn't end with a hug. It ended with a tense, uncertain truce. But the plan was in motion. 3 months later, I was on a one-way flight back to Bucharest with 2 suitcases and a carry-on. That was it. My entire life, condensed. The feeling wasn't fear. It was finality. The project of my old life was officially complete. Alina and I found an apartment on the 3rd floor of a modern building, just a 10-minute walk from a beautiful park. It had 2 bedrooms, one for us, one for my woodworking tools and her translation work. The rent was $850 a month. It was clean, it was bright, and it was ours. We spent the first few weeks just building a life. We bought furniture. We figured out which markets had the best produce. I set up my workshop in the spare room and started simple, making a bookshelf, a small coffee table. The feeling of sawdust in my hands, of taking a piece of wood and making it into something useful, it was like a part of me I thought was dead came back to life. But the real world was always there, waiting outside our door. The first time we went out to a nice restaurant together, I felt it. The hostess's eyes flickered from me to Alina and back again. The table of men next to us, their conversation dropping to a whisper, followed by a quiet laugh. I felt my face get hot. My old fear, that internal conflict, it came roaring back. Was this what my life was going to be? A constant series of sideways glances and judgments from strangers? I must have tensed up because Alina put her hand on mine across the table. She didn't look at the other table. She just looked at me. And she smiled, that same confident smile from the first day we met. She said, "Let them have their story, John. It has nothing to do with us." Just like that, she broke the spell. She was the anchor. Her confidence became my confidence. The real test came 6 months after I moved. My daughter, Sarah, announced she was coming to visit. For a week. The subtext was clear. She was coming for an inspection. The first few days were awkward. I could feel her watching us, analyzing every interaction. She and Alina were polite, but careful. I didn't try to force it. I just let her see our life. I'd make coffee for everyone in the morning. Alina would be at her desk, working on a translation, and I'd be in the spare room, sanding down a piece for a new chair I was building. Sarah would watch us, talking about our days, planning our weekend, laughing at some stupid joke. There was no big drama. There was just the quiet, comfortable rhythm of 2 people who genuinely enjoyed being together. The turning point came on her last night. We went out for dinner, to that same restaurant where I'd felt the stares. I was braced for it to be uncomfortable. But this time, I didn't even notice if anyone was looking. I was too busy listening to Alina and Sarah talk. They were talking about their careers, about the challenges of being a young woman in their respective fields. And I saw my daughter looking at Alina not as her dad's young girlfriend, but as a peer, as a smart, ambitious woman she had something in common with. Later that night, back at the apartment, Sarah found me in the workshop. She picked up a small, carved bird I had been working on. She turned it over in her hands. And then she said, "She makes you happy, Dad. I haven't seen you this happy since, well, ever, I guess." She looked up at me, and her eyes were a little watery. "I'm sorry I was so worried. I get it now. That was it. That was the blessing. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was real. It was the final piece of the project falling into place. The foundation was solid." That night, after I walked Sarah to her taxi for the airport, I came back into the apartment and just stood there in the living room. The lights were off. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside. I could smell the lemon polish Alina used on the bookshelf I built. And in that silence, it hit me. Not like a thought, but like a physical force. The project was done. The final inspection was passed. The structure was sound. There was nothing left to prove. To my kids, to my friends back home, to the strangers in the restaurant, to myself. The fear I had carried for so long, the one that whispered I was a fool, an old man buying a fantasy, it was gone. It didn't just fade. It broke. It shattered. And the space it left behind wasn't empty. It was filled with a profound, quiet peace. That was 2 years ago. Our life isn't a dramatic movie. It's better. It's real. My pension, that $4,500 a month, is more than enough. Our total costs are about $2,000 a month, sometimes less. The rest goes into savings, or a trip, or a new tool for my workshop. That big nest egg, the $650,000, I haven't had to touch it. It's just a safety net I don't think about. My days are full. I'm up with the sun. I'll walk to the park. I'll spend the afternoon in my workshop, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the apartment. Alina is at her desk, in the same room, building her own career. Sometimes we don't talk for hours, but the silence isn't empty anymore. It's comfortable. It's the silence of two people working on their own projects, side by side. The whispers and the stares from strangers, they still happen sometimes. But they feel like they're coming from behind a thick wall of glass. I can see them, but I can't hear them anymore. The story they're telling has nothing to do with the life we are living. Look, your story doesn't have to look like mine. You don't have to move to Romania. But if you feel invisible, like your best years are in the rearview mirror, that's a story you can refuse to accept. The world is bigger and more welcoming than the four walls of your old life. So start with one thing. The one thing that changed everything for me. Be brutally honest with yourself about what you truly want, not what you think you're supposed to want. Once you know the answer to that, you can start drawing up the plans for the rest of your life. That quiet truce with my daughter turned into a real peace. That was 2 years ago. Our life today isn't some whirlwind romance you see in the movies. It's better than that. It's calm, it's steady, and it's real. We still live in that same 2-bedroom apartment. The rent is still $850. My woodworking hobby has kind of taken over the spare room. I've built most of the furniture we have now. Our total monthly expenses for everything run about $2,000. My pension, that same $4,500, covers it all with plenty to spare. That nest egg, the $650,000 I came here with, I haven't touched a penny of it. It's just sitting there, a safety net I rarely even think about. The stares from strangers still happen sometimes. The whispers haven't vanished completely, but they feel different now. They feel distant, like listening to a radio station with bad reception. They're just noise. What's real is waking up in the morning and making coffee for 2. It's spending an afternoon in my workshop with Alina at her desk on the other side of the room, both of us working on our own projects together. The silence isn't empty anymore. It's full. So, if you're sitting where I was sitting 3 years ago, in that quiet room, feeling like the credits have already rolled, I'm not going to give you a bunch of philosophical advice. I'm a project manager. I'm going to give you a plan. First, stop letting other people's fears become your own. My daughter, my friends, they were all worried about the story this would tell. A story about a fool and his money. I had to stop listening to their story and start living my own. The judgment of others only has the power you give it. Second, you can't solve a problem from a distance. The spreadsheets told me moving was logical. The forums gave me data. But fear lives in the space between the data and the reality. I had to get on a plane, book a trip, call it a vacation, call it a scouting trip, call it whatever you need to, but you have to walk the dirt. You have to see with your own eyes if the blueprint matches the building site. Your life is not a theoretical problem. And third, build your foundation on respect before you even think about romance. My connection with Alina didn't start with a pretty picture and a flirty message. It started because I respected her intelligence, and she respected my experience. We were 2 competent people who saw value in each other long before anything else happened. That's a foundation you can build on. Everything else is just decoration. Look, your story doesn't have to look like mine. You don't have to move to Romania. But if you feel invisible, like your best years are in the rearview mirror, that's a story you can refuse to accept. The world is bigger and more welcoming than the 4 walls of your old life. So start with one thing. The one thing that changed everything for me. Be brutally honest with yourself about what you truly want, not what you think you're supposed to want. Once you know the answer to that, you can start drawing up the plans for the rest of your life.